Good evening. How's everybody doing? Good to be learning with you on a Thursday, Yom Hamishi. Let's light up the darkness. I understand there's some compelling television tonight, the State of the Union address that we're competing with. So shkoyach, yasher koach that you're here learning. But in fact, it will be a short class tonight because this daf is a pretty quick one. So, who's in the house? Nancy in North Carolina, Shandor in the Bronx, Joe in the Inland Empire, Yehud in South Carolina, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Bella in Florida, Melissa in Great Neck, Lucy in Minnesota, Sharon in New Jersey, David in Indiana, Paula in the Great Northwest, and on the YouTube side, Chaim is in the house, and Ella, and Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. Also, Shona, that's a new name, Shona in Canada, and Guy in Ohio. Welcome. Great to have you with us. Our daf is page 8. Page Ches, here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1. Here in chapter 1, two people come to the court clutching a garment. Both of them are holding the garment, and both claim, I found it, and it's all mine. And so we saw that the ruling was that each is going to swear an oath that no less than half belongs to him or her, and then they're going to divide the garment, either literally cutting it in half, or more likely, they're going to sell it and divide the proceeds. We picked this up a few lines from the top on page 8a. Based on an inference from this Mishnah, Rami Bar Chama says, that is to say, in a case of one who performs an act of acquisition, a kinyan, by lifting a found item on behalf of another, the other person, i.e. the latter, acquires ownership of the item. Now, let's just unpack that a little bit. What's going on here is there's a couple principles at work. One is another person can acquire an object for you, right? So I have purchased a horse, and now I'm going to I've already given the money, but I have not formally acquired the horse. And rather than go over to the seller of the horse and acquire it myself, I can send an agent to do that on my behalf. He can acquire it for me because I've appointed him to do that. I've made him my agent. He has acquired agency for this task, and he can go and then acquire the horse. And the typical way of acquiring an animal, the formal act of acquisition, when it passes from the possession of the seller to the possession of the buyer, is that the buyer or his agent will pull the horse, lead the horse, make the horse move. Witnesses can see that. And now the horse has entered my possession, even if it's my agent doing it on my behalf. Now, can an agent do something like that for me if I have no knowledge of it, if I have not appointed him to be my agent? Basic rule of that is you can act as somebody's agent without their knowledge if the thing that you're doing has no negative repercussions. There's nothing negative about it whatsoever. It's only positive, right? So I won the lottery. I didn't know. Somebody goes and acquires the money for me. He's not taking any of it for me. He's not taking any of the money for this task. He's simply acquiring it on my behalf so that I do not lose this opportunity. Maybe there was a deadline. If I didn't pick it up by a certain date, I would lose it. Somebody steps in and says, I'm acquiring this on behalf of Sal. I don't lose anything by that. He can do it. Now, what does it mean here that where these two people are each clutching a garment that they apparently found together, right? They both claim they found it. Let's say that maybe the situation was that they ran to it at the same time and they picked it up at the same time. So each is trying to acquire it for himself. What could this mean, that acquisition, as it were, where they are acquiring each for the other? Because if they weren't doing that, if you pick something up and you only pick up one side of it, so that the half of it remains on the ground, so you didn't acquire it, right? And then nobody acquired it, so somebody tried to make a partial acquisition of something by picking it up, but only picked up one end of it. If he did it, and the idea is, since they're both picking it up, if one of them were to drop it, it would fall on the ground. So each one alone is only making a partial acquisition. By working together, we say that each acquires on behalf of the other, my half and his half, complementary halves. And the reason that matters is so that they, as a pair, and they're going to argue about who acquired what percentage of it or whatever, but as a pair, they acquired that object. It has now been found and claimed. And a third person can come along and say, well, you guys didn't acquire it because you're arguing about it, so I'm acquiring it for myself. That's really what's going on here when we say that each is acquiring on behalf of the other. They're arguing about it, but between the two of them, they have acquired. They can, later litigate or argue about who acquired what as between them. But between the two of them, they've acquired the garment and somebody else can't come along and pick it up. Now, Rami Bar Chama explains how he's inferring this from our Mishnah. As if it enters your mind that if one lifts a found item for another, the other does not acquire the item, so then the garment has not been acquired by either of the two litigants, as each prevents the other's acquisition. If that were the case, this part of the garment held by one of them would be considered as though it is still lying on the ground. And that part of the garment held by the other one would be considered as though it is still lying on the ground. And neither this one nor that one acquires it. So if a third party takes it, it is his. Rather, isn't it correct to conclude from it that in a case of one who performs an acquisition by lifting a found item on behalf of another, the other acquires the item, as I've explained. Now, Rava said, no, Rami Bar Chama, this is not a proof. You can't infer that from our Mishnah. As actually, I could say to you that in a case of one who performs an act of acquisition by lifting a found item solely on behalf of another, the other person does not acquire the item. And here in the Mishnah, this is the reason the two litigants acquire the garment. Since each of the litigants acquires part of the garment for himself, he also acquires the other part for the other one, right? He's acquiring some for himself and some for the other one. That's why it works. But can you acquire entirely for someone else? Yes, you can. But remember, if there's any negative impact, then you don't, because he didn't appoint you. And acquiring a found object may have a negative to it, certainly vis-a-vis other people who don't have the chance to find it, and maybe even vis-a-vis the person that you're acquiring it for, because he didn't want to be responsible for a lost object. But here, where both of them are trying to acquire, it's going to work because each is acquiring for himself and for the other, and it's complementary. Now, Rava adds, know, K-N-O-W, that one who acquires an item for himself can acquire part of that object for another. As if someone says to his agent, go out and steal an item for me, and the agent stole that item, so the one who sent him is exempt from liability due to the principle that there is no agency for sin. right? If I say to you, go steal an object, you go steal it. And then when you get caught, you say, well, Sal told me to do it. And so the cops are going to say, and who told you to listen to Sal? Sal was, saying something stupid. It is not permitted to go and steal. And you were not his agent. You just took bad advice and you went and stole something. But if I said, you and I are partners, we're going to steal this thing together, you pick it up. Now he's acting on behalf of himself and me. That's a different story. Partners who stole an item together are both liable, even if only one of them actually lifted the item. And what is the reason that they are both liable? Is it not because we say that since the one who lifted the item acquires part of it for himself, he also acquires the other part for the other one, his partner? And the Gemara concludes, learn from it, that this principle is correct. Rava said in continuation of his statement, now that you said that we say migo, right? So migo is a type of kind of legal device where you say that since it's possible, the word migo means since it's possible to say such and such, it follows that such and such, therefore the principle is established. There's a lot of different ways that since can be used, that migo can be used. Often it's used since he could have claimed that he had nothing to do with it, but instead he said, that he owes part of it. We believe him when he says he owes part of it. Right? That's one of the uses of this migo principle. So how is he using it here? Rava said, now that you said that we say since one acquires part of an item for himself, he can also acquire the other part for the other. Another law can also be derived. In a case of a deaf mute and a mentally competent person who lifted a found item simultaneously, since the deaf mute acquires his part of the item, the mentally competent person also acquires his portion. This, in fact, is not the law. Now, just backing up for a second, obviously deaf mutes are not per se mentally incompetent, but under, this ancient set of laws, where deaf mutes, didn't have the ability to communicate in the ancient world. They hadn't developed sign language. They hadn't developed, all the different kinds of tools where deaf mutes could show that they understood everything, and often couldn't learn how to write because there wasn't that kind of education. So deaf mutes are considered like imbeciles and minors, in the sense that they're actually shielded from liability and don't have obligations, like other adults do. So in other words, you cannot appoint a deaf mute to go acquire something for yourself, and deaf mutes are going to have trouble acquiring things for themselves. So a deaf mute can't act as the agent of another person. And since we're saying when two people pick up something and they're both, they're gonna argue over who gets it, but as a pair they have acquired it, then they're acting as each other's agents, and the deaf mute can't act as the agent of the mentally competent person. We're going to see, however, that the sages issued some rabbinic ordinances to protect deaf mutes. So the Gemara asks, well, granted, the deaf mute, now the Rava says that if the deaf mute can function this way, can co-acquire, so to speak, with a mentally competent person, but that's going to be disproven. So the Gemara asks, granted, the deaf mute acquires his portion of the found item as a mentally competent person lifted it for him. Since the mentally competent person acquired his own part, he also acquired the other part for the deaf mute. But how does the mentally competent person acquire his part? He needs a deaf mute to acquire it for him, and a deaf mute cannot acquire an item for another by acting as his agent. So rather, say Rava's statement differently. The deaf mute acquires his part, but the mentally competent person does not acquire his part. And what is the principle of migo from which Rava derives this law? It is not the principle that one who acquires a found item for himself can acquire part of it for another person as well. But rather, we say migo, since in general two deaf mutes who pick up an item simultaneously do acquire it, in this case too, the deaf mute acquires it even though the mentally competent person does not acquire it. The Gemara asks, what is this derivation? Even if you say that in a case of one who performs an act of acquisition by lifting a found item on behalf of another, that the other person acquires it, as Rami Bar Chama says, this statement applies only where he lifts it with the intention of having the other person acquire the item. But in this case, the mentally competent person lifted the item with the intention of acquiring it for himself, and he had no intention of acquiring it for the deaf mute. If he does not acquire the item for himself, does he acquire it for others? Rather, say that since the mentally competent person does not acquire any part of the found item, the deaf mute does not acquire it either. Now, what's interesting is that the rabbinic ordinance says that if two deaf mutes find, even though they can't act as agents for mentally competent people, they can acquire the object. And this was to protect them, that people will say, oh, well, he's just a deaf mute. He can't acquire things. I'll just take it from him. Answer, no, by rabbinic ordinance, you cannot do that. And if you would say, in what way is this case different from the general case of an item that was found by two deaf mutes in which they both acquire it? And the answer is that in that case, the sages instituted an ordinance for them that they both acquire the item so that they will not come to quarrel with others who want to take the item from them due to the fact that a deaf mute lacks halachic, which is to say legal ability to acquire the item. Here, in the case of the deaf mute and the mentally competent person, the deaf mute says to himself, if even the mentally competent person does not acquire the item, can I acquire it? Therefore, in that case, he will not quarrel if others take the item. So Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ada, said to Rav Ashi, from where in the Mishnah is Rami Bar Chama's inference drawn? If we say that he infers it from the first clause of the Mishnah, two people come in holding a garment, then isn't the case there one in which this one says, all of it is mine, and I lifted the entire garment, and that one says, all of it is mine, and I lifted the entire garment. So how can the law where one acquires an item for another be inferred from a case where they're not trying to acquire for the other person at all? They're only trying to acquire for themselves. So rather, it must be that Rami Bar Chama infers his ruling about people acquiring for each other from that which is taught later in our Mishnah, where this one says it is all mine, and where this one says all of it is mine, and that one says all of it is mine. So why do I need this case as well? The first case, where each one says, I found it, is sufficient. So rather, learn from the superfluous case in the Mishnah that even if they lifted it simultaneously, they divide it between them, and a third party who comes along has no rights to it, because you can argue about who acquired more or less, but between these two who came and acquired first, the object belongs to them to the exclusion of some other third party. So a third party has no right to take it, as in a case of one who performs an act of acquisition by lifting a found item on behalf of another, the other person acquires the item. So the Gemara asks, but that clause in the Mishnah, where each one says all of it is mine, that's not superfluous. We needed that in order to understand the case of the two who say, I found it. Didn't we already establish that the first clause is referring to a dispute over a found item? And then when we added that each one says all of it is mine, that this adds to the situations where our Mishnah applies a case of buying and selling. Not they both found something, that was lost irretrievably by someone who can't be identified, but also a case where both of them gave money, let's say to a shopkeeper, for a unique object in the store, like he sold it twice. He sold it to two of them. So both of them feel that they're entitled to the object that they paid for. They're going to have, some kind of a right, some kind of recourse against the shopkeeper. But in the meantime, who gets to keep the object? And our Mishnah says this is also a case where they're going to end up dividing the object. Now, rather, Rami Bar Chama must have inferred his ruling not from the clause of our Mishnah which says two men found it, not from the clause which says, and they both say all of it is mine, but rather from an even later clause, right? Where in the Mishnah it said that one of them says all of it is mine, and the other one says half of it is mine. So why do I need this case as well? What does it add to the previous cases? Rather, learn from this superfluous case in the Mishnah that in a case of one who performs an act of acquisition by lifting a found item on behalf of another person, the other person acquires the item. And the Gemara asks, and from where is it inferred that this clause is referring to a found item? Perhaps it is referring to another case of buying and selling. And if you would say, if it were referring to a case of buying and selling, what would be the purpose of stating it as it adds no novel ruling? One could answer that it was necessary to teach this additional case, as otherwise it might enter your mind to say that the one who says half of it is mine should be considered the equivalent of one returning a lost item, meaning he could have claimed that the garment was entirely his, and instead he conceded half of it to the other party, and consequently he should be exempt from taking an oath, right? Our Mishnah said you have to take an oath. Well, maybe this guy said, well, if I'm not claiming that it's all mine, if I only claim that, well, I'm just entitled to half of it, then I won't have to take an oath. And to counter that, the Mishnah taught us that he is not exempt from taking an oath. Why? Because perhaps this person is employing artifice. Perhaps he is thinking, if I say that all of it is mine, I will need to take an oath. I will state this claim that half of it is mine, as I will thereby be considered the equivalent of one returning a lost item, and I will be exempt from taking an oath, right? One who finds a lost item is exempt from taking an oath, and he's going to be in that category, he thinks. Therefore, this clause is not superfluous. It teaches that this litigant is not considered the equivalent of one returning a lost item. So rather, Rami Bar Chama infers his ruling from another clause in our Mishnah, that if two people were sitting on an animal and each of them claims that it is his, each of them takes an oath and they divide the value of the animal. Why do I need this case as well? Haven't we already learned that from the garment? It teaches no novel law. So rather, learn from this seemingly superfluous clause in the Mishnah that in the case of one who performs an act of acquisition by lifting a found item on behalf of another, the other person acquires the item. Remember, we need them to complete the act of acquisition, even though two are lifting it together or two are taking the animal together. Because if each one individually is only lifting half an item so that the other one wasn't there, he would not have picked it up off the ground. He wouldn't really have led the animal anywhere. Then neither one acquired, and a third party could come along and take it. That's why we say that one who is lifting for himself or grabbing for himself is also grabbing for the other, and that's why the two of them, as a unit, have acquired the item to the exclusion of third parties. But the Gemara asks, wait a minute, you can't use the case of one sitting on an animal and another one leading the animal to teach that law of Rami Bar Chama, because that case was necessary in our Mishnah. It has a unique purpose in our Mishnah. But perhaps this Mishnah teaches us that one who sits on an animal also acquires it, even though he has not caused the animal to move. Just because you climbed on an animal doesn't mean that you performed a kinyan, a formal act of acquisition, right? To actually perform the kinyan with an animal, you have to lead it. You can even drive it from behind, but you have to cause it to move. Just the fact that you got up and sat on it doesn't mean that you acquired the animal, but perhaps, ordinarily we wouldn't think that, but perhaps this clause of our Mishnah is teaching us that one who sits on an animal does acquire. So rather, Rami Bar Chama must have inferred his ruling from the last clause of our Mishnah. When they each admit to the validity of the other's claim, or when they have witnesses attesting to their claims, they divide the found object without taking an oath. Now, to what case is the Mishnah referring? If it is referring to a case of buying and selling, does it need to be said? Rather, is it not referring to a found item? So accordingly, the reason they divide the item is that they knowingly lifted it together and they intended to acquire it for both of them. So they acquired it. That's why they're going to divide it. And learn from it that in a case of one who performs an act of acquisition by lifting a found item on behalf of another, the other person acquires the item. And the Gemara comments, and Rava said to you that this clause is based on a different principle. When one acquires an item, since he acquires it for himself, he can also acquire part of it for another person. Now, back to the Mishnah. If two people were sitting on an animal, or one was sitting on the animal and the other one was leading it, and each claims ownership of the animal, they must each take an oath, and they divide it. So Rav Yosef said, Rav Yehuda said to me, and now we're on page 8b, I have heard two halachas, two laws, from Master Shmuel. One law with regard to one who sits in a riding position on an animal, and the other law with regard to one who leads an animal. With regard to one case, I heard that he thereby acquires the animal, and with regard to the other case, I heard that one does not acquire the animal. But I do not know which law applies to which of them. So Rav Yosef remembers that he heard the law, but he can't quite put together, what was said about each one, what he heard from Rav Yehuda. Now, that's not surprising that Rav Yosef would be the sage who can't quite remember something, because Rav Yosef famously was a great sage, right? He was the teacher of Abaye and Rava, but he himself, in his old age, or when he became older, it's not that he became senile. It's at a certain point late in life, he had a disease that caused him to lose much of his memory, and then he recovered some of it, but not all. And so we will often see examples of Abaye reminding Rav Yosef of what Abaye learned from Rav Yosef earlier, right? So Abaye, phenomenal recall, and was able to tell Rav Yosef everything that he had learned from Rav Yosef. So the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances if we... So what Rav Yosef said, that with regard to riding on an animal and leading an animal, one of these acquires an animal and one doesn't, but he's not sure which. Okay, so the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? If we say that this is referring to one who sits in a riding position alone, and to one who leads alone, is there anyone who says that one who leads an animal alone does not acquire it? Pulling an item or leading an animal is a classic mode of acquisition, and we saw that in Kiddushin 25b. So rather, if there is a case where it could be said that one does not acquire the animal, it is obviously in the case of one who sits in a riding position that it could be said. Therefore, why was Rav Yehuda uncertain? Was Rav Yehuda uncertain? Was Rav Yosef recalling that Rav Yehuda said he was uncertain? Or is Rav Yosef saying that he was uncertain of what Rav Yehuda said? So the Gemara answers, rather, his dilemma was with regard to a case where one sits in a riding position on the animal while another leads it. So this is that combination situation. That's what gives rise to the controversy. So then what is the law? Which of them acquires the animal? Does the one sitting in a riding position on the animal take precedence, as the animal is in his grasp, since his legs are grasping the sides of the animal? Or perhaps the one leading the animal takes precedence, as it walks because of him? So what we're saying is, well, they're not both pulling the reins, right? If each one took one of the reins and they're both pulling the animal, then it would sound very much like two people are clutching a garment. But if one is leading the reins and the other one is sitting on the animal, maybe they don't have equal right. Maybe one of them acquired the animal entirely for himself and the other one acquired nothing. Which one? Sounds like, well, leading is a classic way of acquiring an animal. Sitting on it doesn't sound like anything, so it must be the one who's leading. But now the Gemara is saying, well, wait a minute. The one who's sitting on the animal, is, in a prominent position on the animal. How can you just dismiss that as an active acquisition? So Rav Yosef said, Rav Yehuda said to me, although I do not remember what Shmuel said. Okay, so Rav Yehuda was the one who was uncertain. Rav Yehuda said to me, although I do not remember what Shmuel said, let us see if we can analyze this ourselves. As we learned in the Mishna concerning the prohibition against leading animals of diverse kinds, kilayim, right? So this is the prohibition on having an ox and a donkey plow together. You can't hitch an ox and a donkey alongside each other to pull a plow or to pull a wagon. And that's one of the chukim, the supra-rational laws that we don't know why. We know we're not permitted to do that just because God said so. Same idea that you can't plant wheat in a vineyard. You can't grow diverse kinds together. You can't pull diverse kinds together, and you can't make a garment of wool and linen together. Those are just laws that God said so, and that's why we do it. It's not for some kind of logical reason. Okay, so regarding this of diverse kinds, if two animals of diverse kinds, for example, a horse and a donkey, are harnessed to the same wagon, then the one leading the animals incurs 40 lashes for transgressing the Torah prohibition. We learn it at Deuteronomy 22:10. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. And the one sitting in the wagon also incurs the 40 lashes because both of them are benefiting from the mixed animals, pulling together. One is leading them, so he has some reason to do that. The other one's actually riding in the wagon. They're both benefiting from it. They've both violated the prohibition. And so they both incur 40 lashes. Again, in terms of the punishment actually being given, it's like never going to happen. It would have to be that someone said to them, if you pull that cart that has an ox and a donkey attached to it, you will violate this prohibition. And then the guy immediately does it. And there were witnesses both to the warning and to the transgression. Okay, then he could be brought to court, to a rabbinic court, when rabbinic courts were handing out these kinds of punishments and get the lashes. But, that so many conditions have to be met that really what we're talking about is liability for transgressing this law, whether or not an earthly court is going to mete out the punishment. So Rabbi Meir deems the one who is sitting in the wagon exempt, as he did not perform any action, right? But the majority say, well, he doesn't have to perform an action. He's benefiting from riding in the wagon that's pulled by these two animals together. And from the fact that in his version of the Mishnah, Shmuel reversed the opinions and taught, and the rabbis deemed the one sitting in the wagon exempt, it can be inferred that he agrees with this opinion, that the one sitting in the wagon is considered to have not performed any action, as the law is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis in their disputes with Rabbi Meir. Right? When Rabbi Meir is the minority and the majority has overruled him, the law is according to the majority. Conclude from it that one who sits on an animal alone does not acquire it, as sitting on an animal is not considered a significant action. And all the more so, one who sits on an animal while another is leading that animal does not acquire the animal. The one leading the animal is doing much more than the one sitting on it. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, didn't you say to us many times with regard to this halacha, let us see if we can analyze this ourselves, followed by the proof from the aforementioned Mishnah. And you did not say to us that this statement was in the name of Rav Yehuda. So Rav Yosef had an illness that caused him memory loss, and consequently some of his later statements of halacha were inaccurate. And Abaye suspected that he attributed this statement to Rav Yehuda erroneously. So Rav Yosef said to Abaye, no, indeed. I remember that Rav Yehuda stated this proof. And I also remember that I said to him in response, how can the master resolve the case of one who sits on an animal via proof from the case of one who sits in the wagon? One who sits in the wagon does not hold the reins, whereas one who sits on the animal holds the reins. And Rav Yehuda said to me in response that Rav and Shmuel both say that holding the reins of an ownerless animal does not affect acquisition of it. Consequently, there is no difference between sitting on an animal and sitting in a wagon drawn by an animal. Just holding the reins does not affect acquisition of an ownerless animal. Pulling the animal, leading the animal, making the animal move will affect acquisition of an ownerless animal. Now, this is relevant because in a purchase and sale of an animal, when you want to make the formal acquisition, the buyer needs to make the animal move, or he could simply receive the reins of the animal from the seller. The transfer of the reins from the hand of the seller to the hand of the buyer is a kinyan. But, for one finding an ownerless animal, a lost object that can't be returned, simply picking up the reins does not affect acquisition. He has to make the animal move. There are those who say that the exchange between Abaye and Rav Yosef was as follows. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, how can the master resolve the case of one who sits on an animal via proof from the case of one who sits in the wagon? One who sits in the wagon does not hold the reins, whereas one who sits on the animal holds the reins. Rav Yosef said to him, Edi taught in a baraisa like this, holding the reins of an ownerless animal does not affect acquisition of it. And it was also stated that Rabbi Chelbo says that Rav Huna says, with regard to holding the reins of an animal in order to acquire it, if he's attempting to acquire it from another person, seller to buyer, he acquires the animal. But with regard to acquisition of a found animal, or with regard to acquisition of an animal that was the property of a convert who died without heirs, leaving his property ownerless, then it does not affect acquisition. The Gemara explains, what is the meaning of the term reins? Rava said, Edi explained to me that they are used like a person who transmits an item to another. Reins here is the word for it is mosera, and transmitting is moser, right? This is the same word as misora, the tradition that is transmitted through the generations to us. I.e., reins are used to transfer the ownership of an animal from seller to buyer. So granted, in a case where one takes the reins from another person, this affects acquisition of the animal as the other person hands the reins to him. But in a case of a found animal or one that was the property of a convert who died without heirs, who is handing him the reins, enabling him to acquire the ownerless animal? Since there was no transaction, one cannot acquire the animal merely by holding the reins. And the Gemara raises an objection from the Mishna if two people were sitting in a riding position on an animal, right? That was also in our Mishna here, the Mishna here at the beginning of Bava Metzia. Or if one was sitting on it in a riding position and the other one was leading it. Then they divided after taking an oath. So in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishna? If we say that it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, now in his opinion, even one who sits in a wagon acquires the animal that is pulling the wagon. Is it necessary to state that one who sits in a riding position on an animal acquires it? Rather, is it not the opinion of the rabbis, and learn from it that one who sits in a riding position on an animal does acquire it? I am so close to done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And the Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where the one sitting on the animal also leads it, drives it by squeezing or kicking it with his legs. Maybe he's not holding the reins, but somebody who's sitting on top of an animal can cause it to move in the direction that he wants. Right? Just think of the bareback riders of the Native Americans, right? They would just hold the mane and, without even saddle and using their legs and their hold on the mane, they could certainly make the horse go where they wanted it to. So the Gemara asks, if so, this is the same as leading the animal by pulling the reins, as the essential factor in both cases is that one causes the animal to move. So why does the Mishnah need to mention it? And the Gemara answers, the Tan of our Mishnah teaches two types of leading, both pulling the animal by the reins and driving it while sitting on it. Lest you say that the one who is sitting in a riding position on the animal takes precedence, as he is both leading the animal and he's also holding it by the reins, the Tana teaches us that the claim of the one sitting in a riding position on the animal is not stronger than the claim of the one who is leading it by the reins. That concludes our daf for today. So let me just take 3 questions. Sharon What if one of the garment grabbers has a great need of the garment and the other has a closet full of garments? Is that considered, even though I realize justice should be blind to each other's wealth or to each one's wealth or lack of it? And that is what I would say. That is what I would say. That because the Torah says specifically, you shall not favor the poor one in litigation nor the rich one, justice has to be blind with respect to, the resources that each of the litigants has, and just has to examine what is their claim to the property in question. And so, what they have elsewhere is not going to be relevant. Jonathan, although I guess it might be relevant if you're trying to establish state of mind when they found it. Is one of them really going to be in such a hurry to grab if he has everything he needs? Or vice versa, this one who is a hoarder, is going to be quick to go and grab something, and that might be evidence of what went on. But it only would be sort of like evidence about what actually happened. And if we really can't establish what happened other than he said, we're just back to the situation of our Mishnah. Jonathan, the topic of lost items always makes me think of who is losing all this stuff. By having traveled, says Jonathan, having traveled recently and seeing plenty of jackets, coats, cell phones hanging around without apparent owners, I suppose it is just as common today as in the shuk of old. So the rules of ownership and returning is critical in order to avoid even the hint of having stolen it. Absolutely right. And I'll just mention that last week I played golf and I left my 60-degree wedge somewhere on the golf course. And I do have my name and phone number on all my clubs. And I was hoping, am I going to get a phone call? And I didn't get a phone call. But when I called the starter and said, did anybody turn in a 60-degree wedge? My name is on it. My name is Sal Litvak. And the starter said, yes, it's here. So I was able to go back the next day and retrieve it. So somebody performed the mitzvah of returning the lost object by way of appointing the starter of the golf course as his agent for returning it, since that was a likelier way to get it done, I suppose. Bill, so question, 2 men come into the court holding a garment. Man A says, I found it, it's mine. Man B says, no, we found it at the same time. It's half mine and half his. When it's divided, do they divide it evenly, or does B have to swear he owns no less than a quarter, as we discussed a couple of dafs ago? Yes, what you said is the second case in our Mishnah, that one says, I own half of it. That's what he's saying, I own half of it. Who's the other half? The other guy. So since they both agree that the one who has who's making the bigger claim does own half of it, both agree that he owns half of it, what they're going to do is divide the rest. And that's why one of them is going to get 3/4 of it and one's going to get 1/4. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Friday, at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific. Have a good night.